The letter arrived on a Tuesday. A perfectly ordinary, sun-drenched Tuesday in May. It came in a crisp, white envelope with a plastic window, the kind of impersonal, official-looking mail you usually throw away without a second thought. But this one was addressed to me, Eleanor Vance, and to my husband of 48 years, Richard Vance. And the return address was a bank I had never heard of. I opened it, my heart a quiet, steady drum in my 71-year-old chest. And then the world stopped. The words on the page were a foreign language, a cold and a brutal and a deeply, deeply unforgiving dialect of legalese. But I understood enough. I understood the words, notice of default. I understood the words, foreclosure proceedings. And I understood the final, and the most devastating, and the most utterly, utterly impossible sentence of all. Failure. To remit payment in the sum of $274,000 within 30 days will result in the seizure and sale of the property located at 124 Oakwood Lane. My address. My home. The home my parents had built with their own two hands. The home they had left to me, free and clear, 50 years ago. The home where I had raised my son. The home where my husband and I were supposed to live out the quiet and the peaceful and the deeply, deeply secure remainder of our days. I stood there, in the quiet of my sun-drenched kitchen, the letter trembling in my hand, and I felt a cold and a sickening and a deeply, deeply disorienting wave of vertigo wash over me. This had to be a mistake. A terrible and a cruel and a deeply, deeply bureaucratic mistake. My house was paid for. It had been paid for half a century. We had no mortgage. We had no debts. We were safe. My husband, my Richard, came home an hour later. He walked into the kitchen, his face a mask of weary, end-of-the-day contentment. He was a history professor, a man of quiet, and of gentle, and of deeply, deeply predictable habits. He kissed my cheek, the same way he had kissed my cheek every day for 48 years. "What's for dinner, Ellie?" he asked, his voice a low, and a calm, and a deeply, deeply familiar rumble. I did not answer him. I just held out the letter. I watched his face as he read it. And what I saw there was not the shock, or the confusion, or the righteous anger of an innocent man. What I saw was the pale, and the sickly, and the deeply, deeply terrified face of a man who had just been caught. He crumbled. He fell apart. He sat at our kitchen table, the table where we had shared 50 years of meals, and he wept. He told me a story, a long and a convoluted and a deeply, deeply pathetic story of bad investments, of a secret business deal that had gone wrong, of a desperate and a foolish and a deeply, deeply secret attempt to get us ahead that had backfired spectacularly. He told me he had mortgaged the house, my house, behind my back to fund this secret venture. He told me he had been too ashamed, too proud, too terrified to tell me. He told me he had been trying to fix it, to pay it all back, before I ever found out. He wept, and he begged, and he pleaded for my forgiveness. He was a broken man, a man shattered by his own, and his secret, and his deeply, deeply stupid failure. And I, his wife of 48 years, the woman who had loved him, and trusted him, and believed in him, I did what I had always done. I comforted him. I held his hand. I told him it would be all right. I told him we would find a way to fix it. Together. But later that night, as I lay in our bed, next to the quiet, and the sleeping, and the deeply, deeply fraudulent form of the man I thought I knew, a single, and a cold, and a deeply, deeply unsettling detail from his long, and his rambling, and his deeply, deeply pathetic confession came back to me. The name of the company he had invested in. A company called Ocean View Properties. And I remembered. I remembered a conversation from a few months ago, a conversation I had dismissed as nothing more than a strange and a fleeting and a deeply, deeply insignificant moment of marital confusion. He had been talking about his new protégé at the university, a young and a brilliant and a deeply, deeply ambitious graduate student named Vanessa Dotoy. He'd been talking about her a lot, and he had mentioned, in passing, that she was spending the summer working for a real estate company, a company that was developing luxury properties on the coast, a company called Ocean View Properties. And in that moment, in the quiet and the dark and the deeply, deeply lonely silence of my bedroom, the truth, the real truth, the ugly and the sordid and the deeply, deeply unforgivable truth began to dawn. He had not mortgaged my house to fund a business deal. He had mortgaged my house to fund his affair. Hi everyone, I'm Grandma Eleanor. I'm 71 years old, and my husband, of 48 years, just confessed to mortgaging my childhood home to fund his affair with a 25-year-old graduate student. He thinks I believe his story about a bad investment. He thinks I have forgiven him. He thinks we are a team, united in our quiet and our desperate and our deeply, deeply pathetic battle against foreclosure. He has no idea that I know the truth, and he has no idea that I am not his partner. I am his enemy. The secret I am sharing with you today is not that my husband is a liar and a cheat and a thief. The secret is that I am no longer the quiet and the gentle and the deeply, deeply trusting woman he thinks I am. For the past week, while he has been busy making frantic and whispered and deeply, deeply incriminating phone calls in his study, I have been busy making a few quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying phone calls of my own. I have been talking to a lawyer, a very good and a very sharp and a very, very ruthless divorce lawyer. And I have been talking to a private investigator. You see, my husband, in his arrogance, has forgotten one very important thing about his quiet and his bookish and his deeply, deeply underestimated wife. He has forgotten that I was a research librarian for 40 years, and I am very, very good at my job. He thinks he is in a race against the bank. He has no idea that he is in a race against me. He thinks he is trying to save our home. He has no idea that I'm about to pay it off in full, and then throw him out of it with nothing but the expensive and the deeply, deeply insulting suit on his back. So please, get comfortable. This is a story about a man who thought he could trade his wife's past for his own, pathetic, and his deeply, deeply sordid future, and a woman who decided to foreclose on their marriage instead. Your support, your likes and subscriptions to Voices of the Forgotten are the quiet and the steady and the deeply, deeply satisfying sound of a gavel that is about to fall. To understand why a man would risk his home, his marriage, and his entire, and his quiet, and his deeply, deeply respectable life for a fleeting, and a pathetic, and a deeply, deeply cliched affair with a woman young enough to be his granddaughter, you have to understand the quiet, and the creeping, and the deeply, deeply insidious disease of a man's late life crisis. You have to understand the slow, and the quiet, and the deeply, deeply terrifying unraveling of the man I had loved for half a century. My life with Richard was a masterpiece of quiet, and of comfortable, and of deeply, deeply satisfying predictability. We were a partnership, a team, a quiet, and a steady, and a deeply, deeply loving couple who had built a life together on a foundation of shared values, of mutual respect, and of a deep and an abiding and a deeply comforting love of books. He was a history professor, a man who lived more in the past than in the present. His passion was the quiet and the dusty and the deeply, deeply fascinating world of medieval manuscripts. He was a man who could spend an entire afternoon deciphering a single and a faded and a deeply, deeply beautiful line of Latin script. He was a good man, a kind man, a man who was, I had always believed, utterly and completely and deeply, deeply incapable of a grand and a passionate and a deeply, deeply destructive act of betrayal. And I was a librarian, a research librarian, a woman who found her joy in the quiet and the orderly and the deeply, deeply satisfying world of facts, of figures, of the quiet and the steady and the deeply, deeply reassuring pursuit of the truth. Our home was our sanctuary. It was my childhood home, a beautiful and a sturdy, and a deeply, deeply loved craftsman bungalow that my parents had built with their own 2 hands. It was a house filled not with expensive things, but with a lifetime of books, of art, of the quiet, and the comfortable, and the deeply, deeply satisfying clutter of a life well lived. It was a house that was paid for, a house that was safe, a house that was, I had always believed, the one, and the true, and the deeply, deeply unshakable foundation of our lives. We raised our son, our Michael, in this world of quiet, and of gentle, and of deeply, deeply intellectual contentment. He was a good boy, a quiet boy, a boy who had inherited his father's love of history and my own love of the quiet, and the orderly, and the deeply, deeply satisfying pursuit of the truth. He had become a lawyer, a man who, like us, believed in the power of facts, of evidence, of the quiet, and the steady, and the deeply, deeply reassuring rule of law. Our life was a quiet, and a beautiful, and a deeply, deeply satisfying poem. And then, 3 years ago, Richard retired. And the poem, the beautiful, and the quiet, and the deeply, deeply satisfying poem of our life together, began to unravel. The man who had spent 40 years of his life in a world of quiet, and of purposeful, and of deeply, deeply satisfying intellectual labor, was suddenly adrift. He was a man without a purpose, a man without a schedule, a man without a classroom full of adoring, and of respectful, and of deeply, deeply validating young minds to shape. He tried to find new hobbies. He took up gardening, but he was impatient and clumsy and deeply, deeply inept. He tried to take up woodworking, but he was careless, and he cut his hand, and he gave up in a fit of a quiet and a sullen, and a deeply, deeply childish rage. He became a ghost in his own home, a quiet and a restless, and a deeply, deeply unhappy man who would wander from room to room, his face a mask of a quiet and profound, and a deeply, deeply unsettling boredom. He was a man who was, for the first time in his life, face to face with his own, and his quiet, and his deeply, deeply terrifying mortality. And then he met Vanessa. She was a graduate student in the history department, a young, and a beautiful, and a deeply, deeply ambitious woman who was writing her dissertation on the very and the obscure, and the deeply, deeply boring period of medieval history that had been my husband's life's work. She began to come to the house at first to consult with him, to ask for his guidance, his wisdom, his expertise. And I, in my foolishness, in my naivety, in my deep and my abiding, and my deeply, deeply misplaced pity for my lonely, and my bored, and my deeply, deeply unhappy husband, I encouraged it. I would make them tea. I would bring them cookies. I would leave them alone for hours in his study, surrounded by his books, his maps, his quiet, and his dusty, and his deeply, deeply satisfying world of the past. I thought I was giving him a gift, a new student, a new purpose, a new and a bright, and a deeply, deeply flattering spark of intellectual life. I did not see what was really happening. I did not see the way her eyes, her bright and her sharp and her deeply, deeply predatory eyes, would linger on the beautiful and the expensive and the deeply, deeply, deeply valuable antique furniture in our home. I did not see the way she would look at my husband, not with the respect of a student, but with the cool and the calculating and the deeply, deeply unsettling appraisal of a woman who is assessing an asset. I did not see that she was not interested in his mind. She was interested in his money. The affair began, I know now, in the quiet and the dusty and the deeply, deeply sacred space of my husband's own study. It was a betrayal of a breathtaking and a profound and a deeply, deeply unforgivable magnitude. He had not just defiled our marriage. He had defiled our home. He had defiled the very heart of our life together. And I, in my blindness, in my trust, in my quiet, and my gentle and my deeply, deeply foolish belief in the man I had loved for 50 years, I saw nothing. I was a quiet and a happy and a deeply, deeply oblivious old woman, living in a beautiful and a quiet and a deeply, deeply fraudulent fairy tale. The fairy tale ended on a Tuesday with a letter from a bank I had never heard of, and the woman who had been a quiet and a gentle and a deeply, deeply loving wife became a quiet and a cold and a deeply, deeply methodical warrior. The librarian had become a detective, and the library, the quiet and the dusty and the deeply, deeply underestimated library of my own and my quiet and my deeply, deeply satisfying life was about to be weaponized. The week after Richard's confession was the quietest and most terrifying week of my life. I was an actress in a one-woman show, a performance so convincing that even I, at times, almost believed it. I played the part of the loving and the supportive and the deeply, deeply forgiving wife. I would make him his favorite meals. I would listen with a look of quiet and of patient and of deeply, deeply fraudulent sympathy as he would tell me about his day, about the stress of his work, about the difficulties with his investment. I would pat his hand, and I would tell him that it would all be all right, that we would get through this together. And he, in his profound and his arrogant and his deeply, deeply satisfying stupidity, he believed me. He saw not a woman who was quietly and methodically and with a deep and an abiding and a deeply, deeply satisfying sense of righteous fury, planning his complete and utter annihilation. He saw a wife, his wife, the quiet and the gentle and the deeply, deeply underestimated woman who had always, always been there to clean up his messes. But while I was playing the part of the forgiving wife, I was also playing the part of the quiet and the ruthless and the deeply, deeply effective detective. My first move was to hire a private investigator, a man named Mr. Harrison, a former police detective with a reputation for his discretion, his efficiency, and his deep and his abiding, and his deeply, deeply satisfying lack of sentimentality. I met with him in a quiet and a discreet and a deeply, deeply anonymous coffee shop downtown. I told him everything: the mortgage, the affair, the name of the graduate student, Vanessa ... and the name of the company she was working for, Ocean View Properties. Mr. Harrison listened, his face a mask of quiet and of professional and of deeply, deeply satisfying competence. He did not offer me sympathy. He offered me a plan. For the next 2 weeks, while my husband was busy trying to fix his financial mistake, Mr. Harrison was busy documenting his life. He was a ghost, a shadow, a quiet, and an invisible, and a deeply, deeply satisfying presence in the background of my husband's sordid little life. He followed him. He photographed him. He documented every single, and every sordid, and every deeply, deeply satisfying detail of his affair. The secret, and the expensive, and the deeply, deeply incriminating lunches at downtown restaurants. The quiet, and the romantic, and the deeply, deeply damning walks in the park. The afternoon visits to a cheap, and a seedy, and a deeply, deeply satisfying motel on the outskirts of town. He also investigated Vanessa , the brilliant, and the ambitious, and the deeply, deeply predatory graduate student. And he discovered, to no one's surprise, that she was not just a student. She was a con artist, a beautiful, and a charming, and a deeply, deeply effective con artist who had a history of preying on older and wealthier and deeply, deeply foolish married men. And then he investigated Ocean View Properties. And what he found was the final, and the most beautiful, and the most deeply, deeply satisfying nail in my husband's coffin. Ocean View Properties was not a real estate development company. It was a shell corporation, a front, a beautiful, and an intricate, and a deeply, deeply fraudulent illusion, designed to do one thing, and one thing only: to funnel money from the pockets of foolish and of love-struck and of deeply, deeply pathetic old men into the bank account of a young and a beautiful and a deeply, deeply evil young woman. And the sole proprietor of that corporation, the brilliant and the visionary and the deeply, deeply criminal CEO of Ocean View Properties, was my husband's mistress, Vanessa Derline. The money, my money, the money from the mortgage on my home, had not been invested. It had been stolen. It had been funneled directly into her company, into her life, into her beautiful and her expensive and her deeply, deeply satisfyingly fraudulent world. Mr. Harrison presented me with his findings in a thick and a heavy and a deeply, deeply satisfying manila folder. It was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, a beautiful and a terrible and a deeply, deeply satisfying biography of my husband's secret life. I sat in my quiet and my sun-drenched and my deeply, deeply satisfying living room, and I read it. And as I read, the last and the final and the deeply, deeply foolish vestiges of the love I had once felt for my husband, they withered and they died and they turned to ash. And in their place, a new and a beautiful and a deeply, deeply satisfying feeling was born. The feeling of pure and of unadulterated and of deeply, deeply righteous and of deeply, deeply liberating rage. The time for quiet and for patient and for deeply, deeply unsatisfying investigation was over. The time for loud and for public and for deeply, deeply satisfying action had arrived. My lawyer, Mr. Gable, was a man who appreciated the art of a good and a quiet and a deeply, deeply satisfying legal ambush. The plan we devised was not a plan of quiet negotiation. It was a plan of war. A quiet and a legal and a deeply, deeply satisfying war. Mr. Gable's first move was to contact the bank that held the mortgage on my home. He presented them with the evidence of the fraud, the forged signatures, the false pretenses, the shell corporation. The bank, faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence of their own and their deeply, deeply embarrassing lack of due diligence, had no choice. They agreed to nullify the mortgage, to erase the debt, to pretend that the entire and the sordid and the deeply, deeply satisfying affair had never happened. My house was mine again, free and clear. His second move was to contact the university where my husband had taught, with such quiet and such gentle and such deeply, deeply fraudulent dignity for 40 years. He presented them with the evidence of my husband's affair with a graduate student, of his financial entanglement with her, of his profound and his deeply, deeply satisfying abuse of his position and his power. The university, a place that valued its reputation and its endowment and its deeply, deeply fragile sense of moral superiority above all else, was horrified. My husband was not just fired. He was disgraced. His 40-year career, his legacy, his entire, and his quiet, and his deeply, deeply fraudulent professional life was over. And the third, and the final, and the most beautiful, and the most deeply, deeply satisfying move of all was the one I made myself. I waited for a Tuesday, a perfectly ordinary, and a sun-drenched, and a deeply, deeply satisfying Tuesday. The day the foreclosure notice had said my world would end. And I waited for my husband to come home. He walked in the door, his face a mask of weary, and of defeated, and of deeply, deeply pathetic despair. He had been at the bank all day, trying and failing to secure a loan to pay off the mortgage, to save our home, to fix the terrible and the secret and the deeply, deeply satisfying mess he had made of our lives. He looked at me, his eyes full of a quiet and a desperate and a deeply, deeply unconvincing plea for sympathy, for forgiveness, for a miracle. And I smiled, a quiet and a calm and a deeply, deeply satisfying smile. "Don't worry, Richard," I said, my voice as smooth and as sweet and as cold as ice cream. "I've taken care of it. The mortgage, it's all been paid off. The house is safe. The relief that washed over his face was a thing of pure and of childlike and of deeply, deeply pathetic beauty. "Oh, Ellie," he whispered, his voice a raw and a broken and a deeply, deeply satisfying thing. How did you do it?" "I have my ways, darling," I said, my voice a low and a mysterious and a deeply, deeply satisfying purr. "And now," I continued, my voice now as sharp and as cold and as clean as a newly cut diamond, "that my house is safe, there's just one more piece of business to attend to." I reached into my handbag, and I took out a single and a crisp and a deeply, deeply satisfying piece of paper. It was not a foreclosure notice. It was an eviction notice. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises, Richard," I said, my voice a final and a quiet and a deeply, deeply satisfying whisper. "This is no longer our home. It is my home. And you are no longer welcome in it." The look on his face, the look of a man who has just been checkmated by a quiet and an unassuming and a deeply, deeply underestimated pawn, was the most beautiful and the most triumphant and the most deeply, deeply satisfying thing I have ever seen in my entire and my quiet and my deeply, deeply satisfying life. The war was over, and I had won.